Hello everyone and welcome to today's webinar. Today we are going to talk about the trade relations between the EU and Japan. My name is Bluth. I'm a project manager in the Global Economic Dynamics project of the Bertelsmann Stiftung, and I'm going to moderate today's session. The outline of the session is as follows. First, my colleague Cora Jungbluth, who is our Asia specialist, will present our new study on a free trade agreement between the EU and Japan. Afterwards, we'll hear from our external discussant, Axel Berkofsky, whom we welcome very warmly, who will provide more insight on the politics of such a deal and also inform us about the Japanese perspective. At all times, you can ask questions which we will collect throughout, and you can do that by using the chat function in your control panel. Already today, the EU and Japan have a persistent and deep trade relation. Japan is the EU's sixth most important export market, and for Japan, the EU is the third most important. Both countries together have a combined share of over 19% of global exports. A trade deal would of course advance these positions, and it will be Cora in a second to give you more information about this. But beyond the numbers, there's something else that is important, and this is the political signal that such a trade deal would send. In a world where the US is openly contemplating introducing import taxes, where protectionism is on the rise, concluding a major trade deal would be an important step to undermine the liberal world trading order. With this thought in mind, I pass over to my colleague Cora, who is going to present the most important economic effects of a free trade deal between the EU and Japan.
Well, thank you very much, Christian, and welcome to all of you out there in the US, in Asia, Europe, wherever you are, from my side too. I would like to dive into the economic effects an FTA between the EU and Japan could potentially have. First of all, since negotiations have been ongoing for a while now, I would like I would like to give you a very brief overview of the current state of negotiations. Actually, negotiations have been started in 2003 with the first round of negotiations in Brussels. There was a process as usual preceding official negotiations, which started in 2011 at the EU-Japan summit, when both parties agreed to assess the impact of such an FTA. And finally, in 2012, the EU Council authorized the Commission to open official negotiations, leading to the first round in 2013. There have been 17 rounds of negotiations so far, the last round in September 2016 in Brussels. And just recently, last week, when Prime Minister Abe visited Brussels, the date was finally set for the next round, the 18th round of negotiations, to take place in Tokyo in April 2017, and both sides committed themselves to try to finish negotiations as quickly as possible, maybe even in the course of the year 2017. Of course, as always with FTA negotiations, there still are some key challenges that had to be solved before the conclusion of these negotiations. From an EU perspective, these include market access to dairy products and the agricultural sector in general in Japan, but also public procurement, which is very much close to foreign companies in Japan, for example, in the railway sector. And one issue for both sides, the EU as well as Japan, are non-tariff barriers to trade in general. More specific issues from a Japanese perspective include the automotive industry, which still has rather high duties in the European Union, about 10% approximately. So Japan is very interested in having a thorough reduction of duties here. Two other issues are investment protection and dispute settlement. The EU has proposed a similar mechanism, an investment court, like in the FTA with Canada. And the EU would very much like to have this kind of mechanism in place in a trade deal between Japan and the EU too. And the issue of free data flows between the two economic powers and data protection is another issue. Both parties have to find satisfying solutions yet. Before turning to the specific economic effects of the FTA, I would like to make a few general remarks on how to understand the results of our study. What you see here is taking Germany's GDP development as example, and it's meant to show you what we are talking about when we are talking about the economic effects the FTA may potentially produce. We're talking about long-term effects here, that is more than 10 years. And the two-headed arrow you see here in the graph indicates the actual effect. So the gap between the situation indicated by the blue line, where we don't have the FTA between Japan and the EU, and the red line is what will happen or might happen when the FTA is in place. So you can see that with an FTA between the EU and Japan, Germany could expect a higher GDP of about 0.1 to 0.7% each year, depending on the scenario of the FTA. We looked into two scenarios here. One is a more shallow or conservative scenario, which reduces tariffs and non-tariff barriers to trade to a lesser degree than the deep scenario, which reduces non-tariff barriers to trade to a degree which is observed in the average of already existing FTAs. So let's look at the actual effects of this specific FTA. One key result of our study is that only the ambitious, that is the deep agreement, will lead to significant effects when it comes to gross domestic product. You see here that in the conservative scenario, the EU28 would gain about 0.06% in GDP, which is rather little. But in the ambitious scenario, they could see a gain of about 0.3%. And for Japan, the difference is even higher, 0.2% in the conservative scenario versus 1.6 in the ambitious one, which is a rather huge difference. And if you take Germany, for example, as one of the major EU economies with very close trade ties with Japan, Germany could increase, as I showed in the last graph, about 0.7% of increase in GDP, which is 7 times higher in the ambitious scenario than in the conservative scenario. The same is true for effect on bilateral trade. We looked at the increase of exports and imports between the EU and Japan in both scenarios. You see that in the conservative scenario we have a rather decent increase in exports and imports, but the ambitious scenario would give a real boost to bilateral trade volumes amounting to a 3-digit increase in both imports and exports between the two economic regions. The third type of economic effects we are looking at here is value added in different economic sectors. Here we can find both winners and losers in both scenarios, the conservative one and the ambitious one. And you may see here on the chart which differentiates between winners and losers in the EU and Japan, that mostly the winners in one of the regions are mirrored by the losers in the other regions. So for example, in the conservative scenario, pharmaceutical products in the EU will gain in value added, while in Japan they will lose. And you can also see this in the ambitious scenario with machinery and equipment, for example, or also pharmaceutical products. And in the ambitious scenario, several sectors may expect a two-digit increase in value added, but the same is true for the losing sectors, which could experience a decrease also in two-digit numbers. So these are the most important results for the economic effects we found in our study, and it becomes clear from the numbers that if both parties want to really give a boost to economic development and trade volumes, they would have to go for a very ambitious, comprehensive scenario. When it comes to the conservative scenario, effects are quite little, so to say. But as my colleague Christian mentioned at the beginning of our webinar, there's more to FTAs than just economic effects. And that is the political dimension, which I think in our current world and our maybe changing world trade order, this is a very important issue. So one could even say that a free trade agreement between the EU and Japan could be something like countering Trumponomics, which stands for protectionism and a retreat from free trade, at least as we have observed it in the last couple of weeks. So the free trade agreement between the EU and Japan has a very high strategic value here when it comes to world trade. The EU and Japan are two major trading powers in this world trade order, and they would clearly commit to free trade and against protectionism if they concluded the FTA. Also, this FTA would be a very strong political signal towards Asia. We see even as we speak here today that the United States are retreating from the region. For example, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, TPP, in which Japan put a lot of hope for its own trade policy, has been cancelled by the new US president. Whereas the European Union negotiating FTAs not only with Japan but also with other Asian countries would signal that the European Union will stay, and it is even strengthening its commitment in the region. And last but not least, it is important to give a signal to Asian countries that there is more, still an alternative left to China in trade policy. Maybe many of you know that there still is the regional comprehensive economic partnership to be negotiated among Asian Pacific nations, and China plays a very important role here. So we see that there are more trade initiatives going on in Asia, and it could be important that some Western industrial powers remain in the region and, as I said, offer an alternative to trade pacts initiated by China. So far for the results of our study, a very brief impression of what we did here. You can of course download the whole study and the corresponding policy brief from our website, which we will indicate once more at the end of our webinar. And without further ado, I hand back to my colleague Christian. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Cora. That was very interesting. We are very happy to welcome Axel Berkofsky as our discussant today. He is joining us from Italy, where he works as the Gianni Mazzocchi Fellow at the University of Pavia and as Associate Research Fellow at the ISPI in Milan. Axel Berkofsky has lived in Japan for 3 years. He speaks fluent Japanese, and he is a well-known expert on the domestic and international politics of Japan, and as well as of the Asian region in general. Excuse me, please. We are looking to hear forward to his views on Japan. Axel, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Christian. And can you hear me okay?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, good. Okay, thank you very much, Christian, and also, of course, thank you very much, Cora, for the invitation. First of all, very briefly on a very short, but substantive compliment on the study. I've had a look, of course, at the study over recent days, and you really have done a very good job. It was quoted also several times in the German media, so you really have done a very good job on this. So my compliments. With this, I'd like to comment a little bit on what Cora has said, but also add a little bit on the possible political implications of that free trade agreement. In other words, what does this free trade agreement mean or could mean for EU-Japan relations in general, and maybe also for the for the whole world, for the larger world. Why do I say this? Well, of course, we know that Japan is not only negotiating an FTA or an EPA with Japan, but at the same time, it is also negotiating an SPA. SPA stands for Strategic Partnership Agreement. So this is an agreement which Tokyo and Brussels negotiate in parallel, and they will only adopt those agreements in parallel. And the SPA is probably not as important, and its impact is not as immediate as the impact of an EU-Japan free trade agreement could be, but it's nonetheless also very important. Why is it important? Because the SPA, which is, I repeat, which is being negotiated in parallel, is envisioned to further strengthen EU-Japan cooperation in politics and security. And of course, this is, of course, potentially, I'd say, and I explained to you why I mentioned potentially. This is potentially very important for the EU-Japan. This goes back to what Cora and also what Christian said at the beginning when we speak about policy implications, when we speak about political signals. Just imagine the EU and Japan adopted the FTA and the SPA together later this year, which is, according to EU sources, still possible. It would indeed send out a very strong signal to the US, above all, about EU-Japan commitment to do more in international trade, international politics, international security. It could send a very positive signal towards the rest of the world that the EU and Japan, at least for now, at least so it seems, are committed and will remain committed to free trade and to expanding their already ongoing cooperations and politics and security. So this is potentially all of this, not only the FTA, but the FTA together with the SPA is potentially the big bang of EU-Japan relations. Really, Japan and the EU, if they really live up to the commitments they have already formulated in both agreements, could really make a difference in international trade, international politics, and international security. So it is potentially a big bang. Of course, it remains to be seen whether the EU and Japan, and this is in particular the case with regard to the SPA, to what I'm talking about, whether they will be able and politically willing to adopt and to implement all of the activities they are envisioning to adopt and to implement in the framework of the SPA. What is the SPA? The SPA is, put bluntly, an attempt to institutionalize the already ongoing non-military security cooperation between the EU and Japan. The EU and Japan are already working in various forms through government to government, through NGOs. They are working already together in Central Asia, in Afghanistan, for example, in some places in Africa, in some places in Asia. So there is already a fairly active EU-Japan cooperation in the areas of security and politics ongoing. The attempt now to adopt the SPA in parallel to the FTA, adding further importance to or adding further substance to the FTA, is to increase that involvement in international politics, is to increase EU-Japan cooperation in the areas I mentioned earlier. And again, this, of course, this has, and one cannot emphasize this enough, this, of course, is tremendously important and the sort of relations the EU and Japan are planning to maintain in the years ahead. You know, the FDA, they're no longer terrorists. Both sides will be able to increase their bilateral trade. On the one hand. On the other hand, they're also willing and politically willing and certainly able also with their resources, even though of course the resources are not limitless. They're able also to show to the rest of the world in general and to show to the US in particular that the EU and Japan remain committed to multilateral cooperation. In this case, of course, bilateral cooperation, but the sort of cooperation the EU and Japan are already adopting internationally and are further developing in the years ahead. Of course, also have a very strong multilateral dimension to it. So it would really, in fact, send out a very, very strong signal towards the rest of the world that in times of illiberal tendencies in international politics, in terms of protectionism, in terms of nationalism, in times of Brexit, in times of other developments, you know, which have had a negative impact on international politics over the last 18 months to 2 years, that the EU and Japan remain committed to free trade, non-military security cooperation, soft power security cooperation, and the EU and Japan are sending out a signal, and whether this will really turn out to be what is envisioned to turn out to be, but are sending out a signal that Tokyo and Brussels remain committed to a liberal world order. I think this is very important. Of course, it remains yet to be seen. We have you know, a draft agreement. Of course, we know what, more or less at least at this point, what will be in the ISPI. And the big question, of course, is, and this of course remains yet to be seen. The big question is whether the EU and Japan are really able, are really willing, are really committed enough to adopt all of the issues that they're planning to do as formulated in the ISPI. That of course includes not only bilateral cooperation in Central Asia, Southeast Asia, and elsewhere, but it also includes, for example, and this has been discussed for a couple of years, this of course could also include you know, sustainable and frequent Japanese contributions to European CSTP missions. So it would be an attempt, or part of the agreement would also be to institutionalize Japanese contributions to European security missions, like the one or like the kind of contributions Japan has already provided the European Union or Europe with in the 1990s. We recall that Japan already had 20 years ago a very active role in reconstructing, repacifying the Western Balkans. So all of this is on the agenda. The only thing that Brussels and Tokyo now have to do is to adopt those agreements. And the signal, the message could be very strong. The signal could be very important. One thing, as I was asked earlier by Christian when he started his moderation, to say something about the Japanese perspective. There I am a little bit skeptical as to what extent I believe the current government under Japanese Prime Minister Abe is committed. And here I'm not talking about the FTA, but I'm rather talking about the ISPI. Is committed. As I said, I'm skeptical about Tokyo's commitment to do all of the things with the same intensity as regards non-military security cooperation with the European Union. All of those things that will be formulated in the agreement. Why do I say this? Why am I skeptical? And I might be wrong. And in fact, I hope I will be wrong. But I could be right. Why do I say this? Abe is, and we have seen this over recent months. Abe has been Donald Trump's first international guest. In fact, he has visited then President-elect Trump already in November in New York and in the Trump Tower. He has shown, in my view, an overly big enthusiasm to continue to intensify security relations with the U.S., to be, as usual, the staunch and almost obedient principal U.S. ally in Asia. So Abe has invested a lot of resources, in my view, a little bit, too many resources into making sure that President Trump will consider Japan to continue to be the U.S. first ally, will strengthen, and this is important, I think, in this context, and I'll explain to you why, will continue to strengthen military ties with Japan. This is very much on top of Shinzo Abe's agenda, which is, in my view, and not only in my view, even more important than, or much more important than expanding non-military security cooperation with the European Union. Abe is more about, to put it bluntly, is more about military security than he is about non-military security. So he might not be, and again, I'm not the only one who's having that rather negative or pessimistic assessment about Abe's commitment to really expanding the sort of security cooperation which will be formulated in the EU-Japan SPA, that he's much more interested in strengthening military ties with the US, and with other countries in the region. For example, with India, with Australia, with even Vietnam, countries that share a common interest to deter the potential threat posed by China's military rise in the region. From a Japanese perspective, of course, this is somehow understandable. Of course, Japan, the EU cannot do much for Japan's national security. The EU is not a military actor in Asia, and of course, the principal military actor and the principal point of reference for Japan in the region will, of course, remain the US, and there's nothing wrong about this. But it could, and with this I concluded, it could take away some resources. It could take away some political will from Japan's commitment to do the sort of non-military security cooperation the SPA is envisioning. So there will be, at least until Abe remains in office, and he will not stay in office forever. Japan's, of course, a democracy, so he might also be voted out of office at some point. Of course, this is possible, of course, and that another Japanese administration may be less committed to only expanding security ties with its main ally, the US, and then with other Asian countries as well, could not be as prominent as it is for the time being. To be sure, a non-military security cooperation, the kind of cooperation the EU, Japan are envisioning in the SPA, and military cooperation with the US, of course, not exclusive. They can also easily complement each other. But again, I believe, and that's my assessment, and really not my assessment alone, is that Abe is much more interested in making sure that Japan will remain the US #1 obedient military ally, as opposed to significantly investing many more resources into adopting the sort of non-military security cooperation envisioned with the EU. And why do I say this? Very last sentence. Because there is certainly interest in adopting those agreements, and Cora alluded to this earlier, when she said that Prime Minister Abe, during his recent visit to Germany, sounded very committed to doing this very soon. We hear this out of Brussels. The agreements will be adopted soon, and this is all immediate. But again, it's also a matter of priorities. And as far as security and political cooperation and security cooperation in particular is concerned, Japan's priorities under Prime Minister Shinzo Abe are not necessarily complementary with the security interests or the interests pursued within the European Union. Thank you.
Thank you, Axel. This was a very insightful presentation, and I think this has helped us very much to understand the politics behind this. We'll now pass on to the Q&A. We already have some questions, but of course, if you have any further, don't hesitate to ask them by using the question section in your control.
Okay.
Our first question actually asks whether you, Axel, could elaborate a little more on the probability that the FTA between the EU and Japan is actually going to be concluded this year, or whether this expectation is not entirely realistic.
Can you still hear me? Yes, you can hear me. I have no idea. I mean, I wonder what Cora has to say on this. I mean, I'm constantly told by colleagues and friends in Brussels and by EU policymakers that you know it's sometimes it's immediate, sometimes it's almost immediate. It's in the offing. You know, it was envisioned to be adopted last year, but it was also envisioned to be adopted the year before. So we really don't know. I mean, there will be an EU-Japan summit, I think, in May, and who knows? You know, they might come up with the papers ready to be signed. But I have my doubts about this, and I think you know, and this is also something that that you can read in the Bertelsmann Foundation study. You know, there are still some areas that need to be resolved. I mean, there's at least one area, and we know about the area. This is government procurement. That is probably. I hope I'm right here, but government procurement is still an area that is on which there is really no agreement on. So there's really a disagreement on this, and I wonder how able and how willing the EU and Japan are able to resolve that particular area. This is really of something that has been standing in the way of the EU and Japan signing the agreement. And of course, the idea is, and maybe that was a mistake, and I've said that many times, and I've written that many times, and was criticized for that many times. The issue is that the EU and Japan have decided to only sign the agreements in parallel. So you cannot sign the FTA without signing the SPA and vice versa. So maybe it would have been more intelligent and wiser to say, look, we can easily sign the agreements separately, because as far as the SPA is concerned, it's much easier, at least as far as I can see, it's much easier to sign the SPA, so the things I've been talking about, than at least so it seems, to sign the FTA. The messages in, you know, the message from the EU is that let's wait and see. But it could be adopted this year. But then again, I repeat, and I don't want to be overly clever here, but you know, negotiations have been going on since 2013. This is not unusual, but I think they might have promised things a little bit too early, too many times, and I hope they can really, you know, put the money where the mouth is this year. But it's you know, I'm probably the wrong person to say something about the exact timing. But I hope that at some point somebody in Brussels will tell me it is going to be adopted in a couple of days. Until then, I remain cautiously optimistic that it can be adopted later this year.
Maybe I can add two points from my point of view, which I think you have not mentioned yet, Axel. Yes. The first one is the situation in regard to the relations between the United States and Japan. So I think the question is still open if the United States will approach Japan to negotiate a bilateral agreement. And of course, the US are a very important partner to Japan, not only economically, but also strategically and politically. So maybe it could be that from the Japanese perspective, it's America first when it comes to trade deals. So we have to wait and see what happens in this regard, and in how far Japan would be willing to first have the FTA with the EU, and then step ahead and see what's happening with the US. But of course, we have to keep in mind that once the FTA with the European Union is settled, the US won't accept any standards lower than set in this agreement. So this is probably from a Japanese perspective rather well, ambivalent, even though they certainly have the European Union as an important partner. The second thing is the situation in the region, in East Asia. There are tensions involving China, of course, and there are FTA deals involving China in the region, RCEP I mentioned earlier, and it of course is important to Japan what will happen in the region this year, and in how far this will impact decision-making when it comes to trade policy. Of course, for Japan, it would be important to still have reliable partners in trade policy in the region. The European Union, as I mentioned earlier, could be one of those. So these are two factors which I think will also influence the process of negotiations.
Of course, yeah, of course, I agree with that. Can I? You can hear me? Yes, okay. Yeah, I agree with this. Of course, it's the irony, of course, in all of this is, and Cora, you alluded to this earlier. The irony in all of this, of course, is that there has been already. I mean, there already was a de facto Japan-U.S. free trade agreement through the TPP, which Washington. Washington under Trump just cancelled. I mean, at least terminated U.S. membership in the TPP. And of course, who knows? I mean, when I was very surprised, but then again, not very surprised. The day after Donald Trump said that the U.S. would no longer be obliged to continue negotiating the TPP, Australia and New Zealand talked about Chinese membership. I said, okay, if the EU is out, then we could consider talking to China as well. We could try to convince China to at least consider the possibility of joining the TPP without the US. And of course, there is certainly a possible connection between the urgency and the speed the EU-Japan will display. As regards the adoption of the agreement, and of course the U.S. factor is going to be very, very important. What we haven't talked about this, and I probably need to talk about this, of course, is not only the U.S. factor but also the China factor. The China factor. China has, of course, has been somehow part of this, and every time I speak to Chinese colleagues and to Chinese policymakers here in Europe or in China. There's a little bit, and that's not a surprise, but there's a little bit of a suspicion, or there's a little bit of a conspiracy theory even circling in Chinese policymaking circles and quarters of Chinese scholars saying, oh yeah, this EU-Japan FTA and this EU-Japan SPA is really also only meant to join the US in containing China economically and politically, and the EU should not do this because Japan is a bad country. Japan is a country that has never apologized for World War II, so on and so forth, and the EU should not be sucked into an agreement with Japan under Shinzo Abe. So there's a lot of suspicion also in Japan, in China, sorry, not in Japan, but in China, on the alleged real motives the EU and Japan have to adopt an SPA in this case, not the free trade agreement, but the agreement that is covering international policy and security. China feels contained. China already feels encircled in Asia. China already feels contained by the US and its allies, including Japan. And from a Chinese point of view, and I'm not saying this is accurate because it is really not. It has nothing to do with conspiracy theory of containment or anything like this, but there is a perception in China that the SPA and the FTA are also meant to be an instrument of containing, or an instrument used to contain China. Of course, it's complete nonsense. It has nothing to do with reality, but it's also something that has had certainly an impact on European preparedness, European willingness to really push for the adoption of agreements with Japan. EU policymakers, and of course Cora knows this as much as I do, and of course Christian is aware of this as well. EU policymakers always take Chinese perceptions, Chinese criticism, Chinese conspiracy theory thinking into consideration whenever they do something with Japan. Yes, the EU and Japan, this is certainly part of the SPA security politics, have become more outspoken about China's territorial expansionism, has become more outspoken together, criticizing China for artificially building islands on disputed island in the South China Sea, and all of this, of course, is being observed with a lot of suspicion, with a lot of mistrust in China. And the SPA, covering policy and security, is, at least from a Chinese perspective, yet another proof, or is yet another piece of evidence, okay, at least from a Chinese perspective.
Axel, I'm very sorry to interrupt you, but we have some other questions.
Sure, go ahead, sorry,
well. So if you don't mind, I think...
No, of course not, no, I finished anyway, so go ahead, please, yes.
Good. Well, we have a few technical questions, actually, about the way the economic effects presented in the study were computed. The first is which model was underlying this. Maybe, Cora, you can say a few more words on this.
Yes, of course. In the study, we actually cooperated with the IFO Institute for Economic Research based in Munich, which did the computation of the effects for us, and they, I have to go back to the presentation. So, sorry for this. Here, this is the methodology. Sorry. The full model is based on. I won't dive too much into the details, but of course we can send out the presentation to participants who are interested, and there is a section in the study with a very detailed description of the model, and the more specific question was, is it a CGE model? Yes, it is. A general equilibrium model which models 45 economies and deals with 57 merchandise and service industries. And the simulation of the effects, as I mentioned earlier with the slide where we try to show you how the effects are actually to be understood, they take about 10 to 12 years to fully come into effect, starting with tariff reduction effects and then going on to non-tariff trade barrier reduction until after a certain period of time effects are fully developed, and then you have the gap between, for example, the GDP development with the FTA and without the FTA, and the gap between these two GDPs remains constant over time after the effects have fully developed.
Thank you very much, Cora. Let me have another look at the question section. Wait a second. Right. So there was another question: which shocks actually drive the scenarios that we studied in the in our computations? Again, Cora, I think you are best placed to answer this question.
Yes, very briefly on this one. We looked at two scenarios, a conservative one and a deep one, or ambitious one. In the conservative scenario, we have a complete tariff elimination in all sectors and a reduction of the costs of non-tariff measures, which in this case are modeled to the example of the EU-Korea agreement of 2011. And which are lesser reductions than in free trade agreements observed in average. In the deep agreement, the ambitious scenario, we also have a complete tariff elimination in all sectors. And in this scenario, we reduce the cost of non-tariff measures as observed in the average free trade agreement already existing. So these are the major drivers in the scenarios.
Right. Thank you very much. We have another question asking us for comments or thoughts on the leaked FTA text. Especially the question is on the scope of regulatory cooperation. Cora.
Well, I've seen this last week, but I have to say that I cannot really comment on the situation, since I just lack detailed information on what will happen next. But maybe Axel, do you probably saw this too, and do you have any comments on this?
Yeah, well, I didn't see it, but I really wonder in these cases, you know, how does this information leak in the first place? Is that a deliberate leak of information to send a signal towards policymakers in Japan and the EU, or is it something that leaked because it was an accident? I'm not a big believer in terms of leaked information in the European Union, because it is really, and Cora, of course you're aware of this, is notoriously difficult to get some detailed and sustainably reliable information out of the European Union. And then now all of a sudden information is leaking, providing details on outstanding issues in the FTA seems a little bit strange to me. I've heard something, but I would join Cora in saying, well, you know, I would like to have leaked information to be replaced with verifiable and sustainably verifiable information. That's hard to say. You know, it's a bit of a shame that we have to rely on leaked information as opposed to real information or fake, you know, as opposed to no. So you know, we are bombarded with fake news apparently. Anyway, you know, on the US, in the US, so I'd like to have some reliable and verifiably reliable information on this. Right? And, this is probably what I would take away from this so-called leak information.
Thank you very much. Well, I think we are reaching the end of our webinar. I hope it has all given you very much reliable information and not alternative facts or fake news. So,
okay.
Thank you very much for tuning in. If there are any questions which we haven't answered, feel free to email Cora. You can find her email address on our website, where you can also find our study. We'll send the slides of the presentation to the participants later, and you can also find a recording of this webinar on our YouTube channel soon. Thank you very much for tuning in, and enjoy the rest of the afternoon.
Thank you very much to both of you.